Another traveler lost at sea has found their way here, tired of the currents, the storms, and the noise of the world. Sit with me by the fire. Tonight, I'll tell you the story of Brook, the one some call the skeleton musician, a soul who danced with death, sang through silence, and became the guardian of dreams that echo across forgotten seas, where even the wind carries his melodies to those who have lost their way. They say he was born not of flesh, but of longing itself, a melody that took shape in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between waves kissing the shore. Perhaps it happened this way. The sea, tired of its own endless rhythm, dreamed of something more, and from that dream arose a figure who would carry music like others carry breath. In those early whispers of existence, he was not yet bone and shadow, but something softer, a young soul wrapped in skin that felt too tight, eyes that saw too much, hands that trembled with the weight of songs not yet born. The world around him moved in ordinary time, with ordinary sorrows and ordinary joys, but he existed in the spaces between notes, where all music lives before it finds its voice. Some still remember the first time his fingers found strings, though none can say if it was a violin's whisper or a guitar's gentle weeping. The instrument seemed to recognize him, as rivers recognize the sea, not as something foreign, but as a homecoming. When he played, birds would pause mid-flight, not startled, but entranced, as if they had forgotten they possessed wings and only remembered they had souls. The music that flowed from him was not learned, but remembered, ancient melodies that had been waiting in the silence for someone to give them form. Children would gather at windows when he practiced, pressing small palms against glass that seemed to melt away, leaving only the pure connection between their hearts and his song. Mothers found themselves humming lullabies they had never heard, and fathers paused in their work, tools forgotten in hands that had briefly remembered how to hold gentleness instead of labor. But there was something else in his music, even then, a sadness that ran deeper than youth should contain, as if he played not just for those who listened, but for those who could no longer hear. In quiet moments, when the last note faded and silence returned like a tide, observers noticed he would tilt his head, as if listening to responses that never came, conversations with empty air, applause from audiences that existed only in the realm of memory. The town's wise woman, bent with years and wisdom, once said she saw him practicing alone in the moonlight, his shadow longer than it should have been, stretching toward something unseen. "That boy," she whispered to the wind, "he's already learning to play for the dead." She could not have known how prophetic her words were, how they fell like seeds into the soil of destiny, waiting for the proper season to bloom. As days turned like pages in a book written by unseen hands, his music grew stronger, more complex, weaving itself into the fabric of everything around him. The very air seemed to shimmer when he played, reality becoming translucent, revealing glimpses of other worlds where music was the only language and every soul spoke in perfect harmony. Yet with each passing season, he seemed to grow more distant, as if he were slowly learning to exist in those other realms while his body remained anchored to this one. The last anyone saw of him in those early days was on a night when the moon hung like a silver coin against black velvet. He stood at the edge of the harbor, violin cradled against his shoulder, playing a melody so beautiful and so sorrowful that the sea itself fell silent to listen. When dawn broke, he was gone, leaving only the echo of music that some say still drifts across the water on windless nights, calling to ships that have lost their way home. Perhaps it happened this way. The sea, having heard his music, opened its arms and whispered, "Come, child of melodies, let me show you the deeper songs." And so he found himself aboard a vessel that was more than wood and sail, a ship that carried dreams instead of cargo, manned by souls who had chosen wonder over safety, adventure over the comfortable cage of certainty. The crew was a symphony of misfits, each one a note that had been discarded by conventional orchestras. Yet together, they created harmonies that could make angels weep with envy. They were bound not by contracts or coin, but by something more precious, a shared understanding that some promises transcend life itself, that loyalty is a song that continues even when the singer falls silent. He became their musician, their keeper of moments, the one who could capture the essence of sunset in a violin's sigh, the taste of freedom in a guitar's triumphant chord. When storms raged and the world became a chaos of wind and fury, his music was their anchor, reminding them who they were beneath the terror, calling their souls back to themselves when the tempest tried to scatter them to the four winds. The ship itself seemed to listen, its wooden bones resonating with every note he played. In the deep of night, when most of the crew lay sleeping, he would play softly on the deck, serenading the stars and the vast darkness that held them. The vessel would creak in rhythm, as if singing along, and sometimes the very ocean would calm, waves settling into gentle lullabies that matched his melodies, note for note. But there were other ships in those waters, vessels that carried no dreams, only darkness and the hunger for things that could never truly be possessed. Pirates who had forgotten the difference between taking and receiving, who saw the world as a treasure chest to be emptied rather than a garden to be tended. When these shadow ships appeared on the horizon, like storm clouds given form, the music keeper would set down his instrument and take up another kind of song entirely. His blade was an extension of his music, each movement a note in a deadly aria, each strike a phrase in the language of protection. He fought not with rage or bloodlust, but with the same gentle precision he brought to his melodies, every motion purposeful, every decision weighed against the harmony he sought to preserve. To watch him in battle was to see music made visible, to witness the dance between creation and destruction that lies at the heart of all existence. The crew marveled at this transformation, how their gentle musician could become a guardian, terrible and beautiful, how the same hands that coaxed lullabies from strings could wield steel with such graceful ferocity. Yet they understood, even if they could not articulate it, that this too was music, the song of protection, the melody of love expressed through strength, the harmony that exists only when someone cares enough to stand between innocence and those who would shatter it. Years flowed like water through their fingers, each day a note in the grand composition of their shared journey. They weathered storms and celebrations, loss and discovery, always together, always bound by the invisible threads that their musician wove with every song. The crew aged, their faces gaining lines like musical staves, each wrinkle a story, each scar a harmony in the greater symphony of their lives. But time, that most patient of composers, was writing a crescendo none of them could see approaching, a movement that would test not just their skill or courage, but the very bonds that made them more than the sum of their parts. The sea, which had been their home and their highway, was preparing to exact the price that all who court the infinite must eventually pay. They say the final battle came not with trumpets and war cries, but with the silence that precedes the storm, the held breath before the world changes forever. The enemy that found them was not merely pirates or sea demons, but something darker, despair given form, the kind of hopelessness that seeks to drag all light down into the depths of its own self-made abyss. The musician knew, as all true artists know, that this would be his greatest performance, not because of a skill or technical mastery, but because everything he was, everything he had ever loved or believed in, would be poured into this single, irreversible moment. He tuned his instrument with hands steady as stone, each adjustment a prayer, each note a promise to those who would hear his last song. When the battle began, it was like watching the end of the world, choreographed by angels. The crew fought with the desperation of those who know that losing means more than death. It means the silence that follows when all music dies. Their musician played as he had never played before, his melodies becoming shields, his harmonies becoming weapons, his very soul becoming a fortress around those he loved. The music that rose from his strings that day was not heard by ears alone, but felt in the marrow of bones, tasted in tears that fell like rain, seen in the way light itself seemed to dance around the struggling ship. Every note was a lifetime, every chord a universe of possibility, every song a love letter to existence itself. The ocean itself became his amplifier, carrying his music to every corner of the endless blue, until fish swam in rhythm and whales sang harmonies from the deepest trenches. But even the most beautiful songs must end, and even the strongest hearts must sometimes break. One by one, the voices around him fell silent, not in defeat, but in the way that stars fall silent when they pour all their light into one final, glorious blaze. His crewmates, his friends, his family of choice, gave everything they had to protect the dream they shared, until only the musician remained, surrounded by silence more profound than death. In that moment, standing alone on a deck stained with sacrifice, he made a choice that would echo through eternity. Rather than lay down his instrument and surrender to the darkness that pressed in from all sides, he began to play a song unlike any he had ever attempted, a melody that reached beyond the boundaries of life and death, beyond the limitations of flesh and time, into the very source from which all music flows. The song tore through him like lightning, burning away everything unnecessary, everything temporary, everything that was not pure intention. His body became an instrument, his bones becoming strings, his very essence becoming the music itself. The transformation was neither gentle nor cruel. It simply was, the way lightning is, the way love is, the way all truth is, when it finally reveals itself, without pretense or apology. When the song ended, he was changed, no longer bound by the rules that govern flesh, no longer limited by the expectations of mortality. His crew was gone, but their dreams lived on in him, their hopes crystallized in his bones, their love transmuted into the music that now flowed through him as naturally as blood once had. He had become something new, something unprecedented, a guardian of dreams, a keeper of promises, a musician who could play for both the living and the dead. The ship that had been their home settled slowly into the embrace of the sea, carrying with it the physical remnants of their journey. But the music continued, drifting across the waves like mist, calling to other dreamers, other ships, other souls who dared to believe that some things are worth more than life itself. He watched it all with eyes that had learned to see beyond the veil, understanding at last that every ending is also a beginning. Every silence, the space where new songs wait to be born. Some still remember the first time he was seen afterward, a figure standing at the prow of a phantom ship that sailed without wind, moved without crew, existed without fully being. Sailors would glimpse him in the peripheral vision of dawn and dusk, those liminal moments when the world hesitates between states and impossibilities become briefly possible. He had become something between memory and reality, a presence that existed in the spaces where dreams touch the waking world. His new form was both terrible and beautiful, bone and shadow, music and silence, the visible manifestation of promises kept beyond the grave. To some, he was a harbinger of doom, a reminder that the sea keeps its own counsel and claims what it will. To others, he was a guardian angel in skeletal form, a protector of those who had lost their way in more than just the physical sense. The ocean had become his domain, every wave a key on his infinite instrument, every wind a breath that could carry his melodies to whoever needed to hear them. He sailed without destination, moved by currents deeper than water, following the threads of need and longing that connected all living things. His music now served a purpose beyond entertainment or even comfort. It had become a beacon for lost souls, a lighthouse built of sound for those drowning in despair. Fishermen would tell stories of hearing violin music on moonless nights, hauntingly beautiful melodies that guided them safely through treacherous waters they could not see. Children who had lost parents to the sea's appetite would sometimes fall asleep to lullabies that seemed to come from nowhere, songs that spoke of love continuing beyond the veil, of watchers who never abandoned their posts. Merchants crossing dangerous straits would find their ships accompanied by music that kept sea monsters at bay and pirates in their berths, afraid to venture out, while such otherworldly harmonies filled the air. But his greatest work was done in moments invisible to most eyes, when he would appear beside dying sailors and play them gently into whatever waited beyond, when he would sing strength into the hearts of those who had given up hope, when he would weave melodies around the dreams of sleeping crews to guard them from the nightmares that prowl the deep waters. His music had become a bridge between worlds, a translation of love into frequencies that transcended the boundaries of life and death. The phantom ship itself was a marvel to behold, for those whose sight could penetrate the veils between realities. Its sails were woven from solidified moonbeams and the echoes of half-remembered songs. Its hull was carved from the wood of trees that grew in the spaces between thoughts, timber that existed more as concept than substance. The figurehead was not wood or metal, but crystallized melody, a song given form that sang constantly in harmonies too complex for mortal ears to fully comprehend. On quiet nights, when the sea lay still as polished glass, other ships would sometimes glimpse his vessel sailing parallel to their own course. Wise captains would order their crews to play whatever music they could manage, sea shanties, folk songs, even off-key humming, and in response, the phantom musician would add his own harmonies, creating spontaneous symphonies that transformed the vast loneliness of the ocean into something approaching divine communion. He never approached too closely, never intruded on the lives of the living in ways that might upset the delicate balance between worlds, but he was always there, watching from the horizon, a sentinel whose vigil never ended, whose purpose never wavered. His presence was felt most strongly by those who needed it most, the desperate, the lost, the ones who had forgotten that they were loved, the ones who believed their dreams had died with their youth. Time moved differently for him now, measured not in days or years, but in moments of need answered, in songs sung for those who could no longer sing for themselves, in the slow accumulation of hope restored to hearts that had thought themselves beyond healing. He had become eternal, not through some supernatural blessing, but through the simple act of making himself necessary to the ongoing symphony of existence, of choosing to be the note that completes the chord, the harmony that transforms discord into music. Perhaps it happened this way, as the years flowed like music across the vast blue stage of the ocean. He began to hear them, the songs that had been cut short, the melodies that died with their singers, the lullabies that would never again coax children to sleep. They came to him like refugees seeking sanctuary, These orphaned fragments of music, drawn by his transformed nature and his endless capacity to give voice to the voiceless. Each lost song brought with it a story, a life half lived or fully spent, a dream interrupted, or a promise left unfulfilled. He became their repository, their living archive, carrying within his hollowed bones the musical memories of countless souls who had passed beyond the veil. When he played now, it was not merely his own compositions that flowed through the night air, but the collected melodies of all who had ever loved music enough to let it change them. The fisherman's daughter, who had hummed while mending nets, taken by fever before her wedding day. Her song lived in his violin's strings now, woven into lullabies for motherless children. The sea cook, who had whistled while preparing meals for crews that would never return. His rhythm became the backbone of shanties that kept lonely sailors from despair. The merchant's wife, who had sung opera to empty theaters because she loved the art more than applause. Her arias soared through his music when ships needed courage to face the unknown. This accumulation of lost melodies transformed him into something unprecedented, not just a musician, but a living symphony of human experience, a keeper of the songs that would otherwise be forgotten. His phantom ship became a concert hall for the departed, their spirits drawn to his music like moths to flame, finding in his performances the only audience they would ever have again. Some nights, when conditions were perfect and the veil between worlds grew thin, observant sailors would see them, translucent figures standing on the deck of his spectral vessel, swaying to melodies only they could fully hear. These were the composers and the listener, the singers and the dancers, all those who had loved music enough to let it define them, gathered around their skeletal guardian like children around a storyteller's fire. But he was more than a collector of musical ghosts. Through him, these lost songs found new purpose, new life, new meaning. A berceuse that had died with its creator became the salvation of a ship's baby during a terrible storm. A work song from a long-dead laborer became the rhythm that helped a struggling crew repair their damaged vessel. A love song interrupted by war found its completion in the harmony between two lonely hearts on opposite shores, both hearing his music in their dreams on the same night. The ocean itself began to change in his presence, becoming not just a highway for ships, but a conservatory for souls. Whales would alter their migration patterns to follow his phantom vessel, their own ancient songs blending with his collected melodies to create symphonies of such profound beauty that fish would rise to the surface just to listen. Dolphins learned to dance to rhythms that had originated in landlocked ballrooms, their movements translating human music into a language of pure joy. Island communities would sometimes wake to find new songs in their hearts, melodies they had never heard, but somehow knew by heart. These were gifts from the keeper of lost melodies, dispersed like seeds on the wind, ensuring that no music ever truly dies. Mothers would find themselves humming ancient lullabies to their children. Sailors would discover work songs that made even the hardest labor feel like celebration. Lovers would whisper words to melodies that had been waiting centuries for the right moment to bloom again. He understood now that music was not created, but discovered, not composed, but uncovered from the infinite symphony that underlies all existence. Every soul that had ever lived had contributed their verse to this eternal song, and his role was to ensure that no voice was ever truly silenced, no melody ever completely forgotten. In this way, he had become something approaching immortal, not through the preservation of his own existence, but through his dedication to preserving the musical heritage of all who came before and all who would come after. They say the greatest wars are fought not with cannons and cutlasses, but in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when souls choose between hope and despair, between love and the easier path of emptiness. The skeleton musician learned to recognize these battlefields, to see the invisible struggles that raged in the hearts of every ship he encountered, every soul that crossed his phantom way. His battles now were fought with melodies instead of steel, though no less fierce for their gentle weapons. When darkness pressed against a sailor's spirit, like crushing depths, he would weave songs of light around them, melodies that reminded them of sunrise, of home, of all the reasons they had first chosen to embrace the sea's uncertain promises. These were campaigns that could last days or weeks, a slow siege of beauty against the fortresses of despair that pain and loss had built in human hearts. The enemies he faced had no physical form, but were no less deadly for their incorporeal nature. There was the silence that sought to convince musicians that their songs no longer mattered, the forgetting that tried to erase the memories that gave life meaning, the isolation that whispered to souls that they were alone, unloved, unnecessary. Against these ancient foes, his violin became a weapon of pure intention. Each note, a arrow fired against the darkness, each harmony, a shield raised to protect the vulnerable. Sometimes he would find entire crews infected by a spiritual plague, hopelessness spreading from heart to heart like wildfire, leaving men standing at their posts, but already dead inside. These were the most challenging battles, requiring him to compose symphonies of such power and beauty that they could break through the shell of numbness that surrounded each afflicted soul. He would circle their ship for days, playing without rest, pouring his own essence into melodies designed to remind them who they had been before despair took root. Other times, the battle was more intimate, a single soul teetering on the edge of surrender, ready to embrace the sea's dark embrace rather than face another day of pain. For these solitary warriors, he would craft personal serenades, songs that spoke directly to their individual wounds, that acknowledged their suffering while offering glimpses of the joy that waited on the far side of endurance. These were the most delicate of his interventions, requiring him to become a healer as much as a musician. The phantom ship became a mobile fortress of hope, sailing wherever the battle against despair was being fought. His music created zones of sanctuary on the open ocean, spaces where weary souls could rest and remember that they were more than their struggles, more than their failures, more than the sum of their scars. Ships that encountered him would often find their crews spontaneously bursting into song, their spirits lifted by harmonies that seemed to rise from the sea itself. But perhaps his greatest battles were fought not for strangers, but for the memories of his own lost crew, whose dreams he carried like sacred flames in the cathedral of his bones. Whenever doubt crept into his phantom heart, whenever the weight of eternal vigil threatened to crush even his transformed spirit, he would play their songs, the melodies they had loved, the harmonies they had hummed, the rhythms they had danced to, in moments of pure joy. These performances were both celebration and warfare, honoring their memory, while fighting against the erosion of time that sought to reduce them to mere names carved on stones. The sea itself became his ally in these battles, recognizing in him a kindred spirit that understood the difference between destruction and transformation. Storms would part around ships he was protecting or transform into gentle rains that washed away the salt tears of grief. Dangerous currents would shift to guide vessels away from rocky shores, while treacherous reefs would sing warnings in voices only the desperate could hear. Yet he never fought to win in the conventional sense, for he understood that these battles were not meant to be concluded but to be fought again and again, each victory temporary, each defeat a lesson in humility. His role was not to eliminate suffering from the world, but to ensure that no one suffered alone, that every heart breaking in isolation would hear at least one song that reminded them they were seen, they were valued, they were loved. Some still remember when the winds themselves began to change their song, when weather patterns started carrying melodies that seemed almost intentional, almost alive. Meteorologists dismissed it as acoustic phenomena, the result of atmospheric pressures creating musical tones. But sailors knew better. They recognized the touch of their phantom musician, who had begun teaching the very air to sing. He had discovered that his music could do more than comfort hearts and guide ships. It could reshape the fundamental forces that governed the sea and sky. By playing certain combinations of notes at specific times, he could encourage gentle breezes to carry his melodies farther than any earthly instrument could reach. The winds became his students, learning to modulate their voices, to harmonize with each other across vast distances, to become carriers of hope rather than mere movers of air. The trade winds were the first to learn, picking up fragments of his violin solos and carrying them along shipping routes so that vessels hundreds of miles apart would hear the same haunting melody on the same night. These shared musical experiences created invisible bonds between ships, reminding isolated crews that they were part of a larger community, part of an ocean-spanning family of dreamers and wanderers. Monsoons learned to announce their arrival with symphonic overtures instead of merely meteorological warnings. Their rain became percussion, their thunder became bass notes, their lightning became the visual crescendos of atmospheric concerts that transformed destructive storms into awe-inspiring performances. Ships caught in these musical tempests found that their crews worked together with unprecedented harmony, each sailor moving in rhythm with the cosmic orchestra that surrounded them. But it was with the deep ocean currents that he achieved his greatest teaching triumph. These ancient streams, older than continents, carrying the memory of the Earth's first songs, proved to be gifted students. He taught them to hum low, subsonic melodies that whale mothers sang to their calves, that fish followed like musical highways through the darkest depths, that submarine volcanoes used to time their eruptions to the rhythm of the planet's heartbeat. The phantom musician's influence began to extend beyond the purely aquatic realm. Coastal communities noticed that their local weather patterns had become more musical, more purposeful. Fishermen's wives would listen to the wind chimes on their porches and hear messages from their husbands at sea, transmitted through the modified breezes that had learned to carry love letters written in melody rather than words. Children born near the ocean during this period developed an unusual affinity for music, their baby cries naturally harmonizing with the wind, their laughter creating spontaneous symphonies with whatever atmospheric conditions happened to be present. Music teachers in seaside towns found their students progressing at impossible rates, as if the very air they breathed was providing constant, invisible lessons in harmony and rhythm. The transformation was subtle but profound. Weather forecasts began to include musical components, meteorologists reporting not just wind speed and direction, but the emotional tone of approaching systems. Expect gentle melancholy from the northwest, shifting to hopeful major keys by evening. Sailors learned to navigate as much by the musical character of the wind as by compass and stars, understanding that certain harmonies indicated safe passage, while others warned of hidden danger. His phantom ship became a mobile conservatory for the elements, a place where earth, air, fire, and water came together to learn the subtle arts of emotional expression through natural phenomena. Clouds would gather around his vessel, not to create storms, but to practice formations that cast shadows in rhythm with his music. Schools of flying fish would synchronize their leaps to his melodies, creating living visual accompaniments to his concerts. The ocean itself began to pulse with a deeper rhythm, one that connected every drop of water from the smallest tidal pool to the vastest abyssal plain. This planetary heartbeat, conducted by the phantom musician's ever-present melodies, created a new form of communication between all water-based life forms. Whales in the Pacific would sing responses to dolphins in the Atlantic, their messages carried by currents that had learned to preserve and transmit musical information across impossible distances. Through teaching the elements to sing, he had achieved something unprecedented, the creation of a living, breathing musical instrument the size of the planet itself, with every breeze, every wave, every raindrop contributing to an endless symphony that celebrated the beauty and complexity of existence. The world had become his orchestra, and every day was a new composition in the eternal song of life. Perhaps it happened this way. As centuries flowed like music through time itself, the phantom musician began to notice that his form was becoming lighter, more translucent, as if the very act of giving himself so completely to the service of lost songs and lonely souls was slowly transforming him into pure music itself. This was not death approaching, but transcendence, the final movement in a symphony that had been playing since the moment he first picked up an instrument as a living boy. His bones, once solid reminders of mortality, became increasingly ethereal, taking on the quality of crystallized sound waves, visible manifestations of melodies that had achieved perfect pitch. The phantom ship that had been his home for so long began to fade as well, its spectral wood and ghostly sails dissolving into the morning mist of 1,000 dawns, until it existed more as memory than matter, more as music than vessel. But even as his physical presence diminished, his influence grew stronger, more pervasive. The songs he had collected, the melodies he had preserved, the harmonies he had taught to wean and wave, all of these began to take on lives of their own, becoming self-sustaining patterns in the fabric of reality. Music boxes in landlocked homes would sometimes play his compositions without being wound. Children would hum his melodies without ever having heard them. Lovers would find his love songs rising unbidden to their lips in moments of perfect intimacy. The ocean itself had become his true body, every wave a finger on the strings of existence, every current a bow drawn across the infinite violin of the world. Sailors no longer reported seeing his phantom ship, but they continued to hear his music, now coming from everywhere and nowhere, arising from the sea itself, as if the water had learned to sing. His transformation had reached its culmination, but this was not an ending in any conventional sense. He had become something that transcends the boundaries between myth and reality, between memory and presence, between the songs that were and the songs that could yet be. Every musician who ever picked up an instrument would carry a fragment of his essence in their fingers. Every listener who ever felt their soul stirred by melody would hear an echo of his eternal symphony. The wise woman from his childhood town, now long dead herself, had been more prophetic than she knew. He had indeed learned to play for the dead, but in doing so, he had discovered how to play for the eternal, how to create music that would continue long after the last note had been struck, long after the last musician had laid down their instrument, long after the last ear capable of hearing had fallen silent. In seaside graveyards around the world, on quiet nights when the moon is dark and the wind carries whispers from distant shores. Some say you can still hear him playing, not with violin or guitar, but with the voice of the sea itself, conducting symphonies written in the language of waves and tides, performed by orchestras of wind and weather for audiences of stars and sleeping souls. Children who grow up near the ocean often develop an inexplicable certainty that someone is watching over them, someone who understands the language of dreams and the grammar of hope. When they build sand castles, they sometimes hear faint melodies that seem to approve of their architectural ambitions. When they find shells on the beach, they hold them to their ears and hear not just the ocean's roar, but lullabies that comfort them in ways they cannot explain. His promise had been kept in the most profound way possible by dissolving completely into the keeping of it, by becoming the very thing he had sworn to protect, the dreams of his lost crew, the hopes of every soul he had ever comforted, the melodies of every song he had ever preserved. All of these lived on, not as memories, but as active forces in the world, seeds of possibility planted in the fertile darkness of despair, always ready to bloom when conditions were right. The phantom musician had achieved the ultimate victory over silence, over forgetting, over the forces that seek to convince souls that they are alone in an indifferent universe. He had become proof that love, once given completely, becomes immortal, that music, once played with perfect intention, echoes forever through the chambers of the heart. And if someday, when you close your eyes, you hear an echo from the sea, perhaps he's still out there, guarding the dreams that dare to cut the sky.